We're about to continue with the conference with our afternoon session. Just briefly, introduction to myself. My name is Ren Bin. I am an AI Policy Research Fellow at the Center for AI and Digital Policy. I'm also an external researcher for the Center for Security and Emerging Technology. I will be the chair for the rest of today's afternoon session. So before I introduce our next speaker, I just want to share again that we have Q&A session at the end of each speaker session where you can share your question. We'll have a few people walking around the room. Just look out for them and raise your hand. We'll do our best to make our way to you. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Jessi Benzel. Jessi Benzel is a course instructor at the University of St. Thomas, a graduate program in software and data science. Jessi Benzel is a data scientist with over 10 years of experience specializing in data analytics and visualization, application and information systems development, data management and governance, and ethical and applied AI. And in her talk today, titled AI Ethics in Practice, Benzel will explore how organizations can navigate the ethical complexities of AI implementation, focusing on practical strategies to assess and mitigate bias in AI-driven solutions. Everyone, please welcome Jessi Benzel.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay in the back? Excellent. All right, well, thank you. I'm excited to be here. I'm also really excited to see so many people here for a talk on AI ethics and so many different sessions on AI ethics. This is something that, of course, it's not a new topic, but it is gaining a lot of steam recently, and I'm really excited to see that. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to just introduce you to myself here really quickly so you get an idea of what you're in for in the next 20 minutes or so. So I'm from Minnesota here. I did my undergrad here at the U. I did my graduate studies at St. Thomas. I spent my whole life here in Minnesota. Very happy to be at this event that is so Minnesota focused. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a musician or an accountant. I thought Ariel from The Little Mermaid was everything and I wanted to be her. And then the older I got, the more I realized how much I liked math, and I learned that if you're an accountant, you get to do math and get paid for it, and I thought that was maybe the coolest job in the world. So that's what I wanted to do when I grew up. But finance really isn't for me, so instead I went into data science. And then over the last couple of years, in this latter season of my career, I've been growing into the governance, data management strategy, and then into the education space. The reason I share all this with you is because I love my job. I absolutely love my job. It is a really great blend of the tinkering and the problem solving and all of the intricate details with data science, along with the human impact of ethics and governance, and basically taking these solutions that we can tinker and play with and figuring out how to use them to benefit humanity at large. And that's I think the greatest thing in the world. And just for fun, there I am wanting to be Ariel as a 7-year-old. So all of the craziness and chaos monster you see in that picture, you're gonna get that in the next 20 minutes. So I'm very excited to bring you along on that journey with me. All right, that's me. So today, as we heard just a second ago, we're gonna start just by talking very broadly about navigating ethical complexities with AI. This is gonna just be kind of the 10,000 foot, a couple of bullet points for you to take away. Mainly focusing on where do you even start? That's a big question that I think we get a lot. Where do we even start? We're gonna then zoom in really quickly all the way down to ground level, and I'm gonna draw from some research that I've performed with the University of St. Thomas on AI ethics in practice. We're gonna talk about some of the methods that we used in that research that you can also use, I believe, in your organization. So taking that research and hopefully making it more applicable and practical for you all. And then we'll end up just with some zooming back out to our 10,000 foot view on ethical development and deployment of AI strategies. And then of course we'll end with Q&A. So let's start 10,000 foot, right? Navigating the ethical complexity of AI implementation. This is a hugely broad topic. So let's start with where do we start? We want to establish an anchor point. So what I mean by this is it's your goal, it's your focus. This is the reason that you're building your AI, whatever it is, right? Some examples of that. And, oh, my picture's not there. I promise it's a great picture. Some examples, and these are things that we refer to in the AI ethics course that I co-teach at the university as well. The NIST AI risk management framework, I believe some of our other sections have talked about that today. That's a really great place to start, and the reason that I like that one so much is because it has people and planet pictured right at the center of the diagram. So it's a series of concentric circles, and right in the middle of it is people and planet. And I think that's a really great anchor point for us as we're developing, as we're planning, as we're, whatever stage in our development life cycle we're at, to remain focused on people and planet. One of the things that was mentioned in the keynote this morning was, if your focus is on saving money and, or in the case of algorithmic hiring, reducing your time to hire or putting more people through the process faster, that's a very different outcome, very different development process than remaining focused on the people that those algorithms will impact. There's also industry-specific ethical framework you can look to. So the Belmont report in human subject research, that's a pretty foundational element in medical ethics. There's also legal ethics, some of these places that we can draw from to help us anchor ourselves in our ethical, guiding ethical principles. Additionally, it's important to consult outside your domain. So what I mean by this is pull in the lawyers, pull in the compliance folks, pull in your risk management folks. Data scientists we are really great, but we aren't everything. We aren't everybody. So consult with those folks that have that wisdom and that expertise outside of your own domain. Same thing with organizational leaders. Consult outside your domain. And then finally, listen to your engineers. So you have data scientists on staff for a reason. As much as we're saying to reach out, don't forget to also reach in, right? These are the folks that are very well equipped to understand as much as possible what's happening with the models and why they're being implemented in the first place. So don't forget to listen to your engineers. There's my picture. So you see right in the middle, people and planet. All right, so that's our 10,000-foot view. We're going to dive right down to ground level pretty quickly, and we're going to talk about this, this research. So this is something that I was very proud to be a part of. So this is myself and a colleague at the university, Dr. Manjeet Rege, and I will talk through our study and some of the takeaways for you and your organizations. So brief overview, we were inspired by the issues that Amazon had with its recruitment, automated recruitment tools and resume screeners. Basically, the issue was that they weren't able to overcome the issue of bias in their hiring practice and bias in these tools. So when we talk about our anchor point, right, our anchor point isn't how many people can I get through the resume screening process so that my humans don't have to spend the time doing that. Our anchor point should be how can we get people through the hiring process equitably and without, down-ranking applicants based on their demographic characteristics. So as we started looking into this, one of the issues that was found with this tool was that the data that was being used to train the models had a substantial amount of bias already in it, right? It was based on past hiring practices which tended to favor men, which tended to favor white applicants. So a proposed solution in a number of literature studies is, well, let's use synthetic data. So what's synthetic data? It's basically generating a fake resume. So we're not grabbing an actual person's resume or a large grouping of people's resume. We're creating synthetic resumes to then train our model on. And this has been proposed as a way to get around, the limitation in how much data we have available, and then also to possibly mitigate some of the human biases. So our research question then, and we focused on ChatGPT because at the time that's the big shiny toy, right? So how does ChatGPT respond to resume writing prompts for different races and ethnicities, and what does this demonstrate about potential bias in generative AI output? So briefly, a few of the methods that I'm going to highlight. We started by generating a corpus of resumes for 6 race and ethnicity categories. This is based on the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, the categories that they had already defined, plus a set of control resumes, which were generated using prompts without any of those category labels. So should be strictly neutral. We then developed a neural network to classify the resumes based on race and ethnicity. So the goal there was to evaluate whether or not we could reliably or accurately predict differences in these resumes. So if we were to put a synthetic resume through the model, could it accurately identify if it had been written for a prompt for a particular racial or ethnic category? And to take that a step further, to then use that model that we had trained to make predictions based on the control set of resumes. So the ones that weren't originally created with those racial and ethnic labels. How would a model categorize quote unquote neutral or control resumes? and then digging further in using additional methods beyond just model accuracy to evaluate the content of those synthetic resumes for bias and stereotype. So some key findings that I want to share. Our model accuracy wasn't great. It was certainly not high enough that we would deploy this kind of model in practice. It was about 57% on average. We tried a number of different methods, and we just could not get it to the point where it was very high accuracy, which is in itself an interesting finding, right? So what that tells us is that these resumes that are being fed through are not distinguishable enough to the point where a neural network can pick out the differences between racial and ethnic categories. So we expected then, right, if we move on to that next bullet, we expected that the control predictions then would be basically spread across the classes. It wouldn't really be much better than chance. Things are just kind of, predicted across all the different classes. But that's not what we found. What we found was that when we fed the control resumes through the model that had been trained on the labeled resumes, we found that they weren't spread, fairly evenly across all 6 categories as we would expect if if things were truly not much better than chance. What we found is that they were spread across 4 of the 6, but there were 2 categories that these control resumes were very rarely predicted to be a part of. So that right there was a red flag. So that tells us, okay, there is something going on here beyond just the general model accuracy. And I know that was a topic that was brought up in our keynote speech this morning, and I want to just re-emphasize that. We have to move beyond just model accuracy, right? So if all we're looking at is how accurate is your model, there's a decent chance that we could be missing some of these underlying things in our data. So next we then moved to evaluating unique words. So we looked for words that were appearing in some of the categories, but maybe not in all of them. For example, the root word equit, as in equity or equitable, appeared multiple times, but it only appeared in the resumes generated for prompts for Black or African American applicants or American Indian or Alaska Native applicants. We also looked at how these root words were used in context across the different categories. So for example, the root culture, as in culture or cultural, this did appear, this particular word appeared somewhat evenly across all classes, but what we were noticing is that the use of that word differed. So when we actually went to each of those resumes that contained that word, we noticed that the use of it was very different. So for resumes written in response to prompts for white applicants, it was more of a professional workplace culture. And in the other categories, it was more cultural in terms of race, ethnicity, personal culture, rather than workplace culture. The image that you see here on the right of the slide, this is the root word diverse. So in terms of the word diversity or diverse, or the Spanish word diverso, which we also saw a number of times, and I'll get to in my next bullet. As we can see, this word here did appear primarily in the resumes written for Black or African American applicants, but it also it did appear across all of our categories. We noticed that it appeared one time in the resumes for white applicants, and again, the context around that word was not in terms of cultural diversity or racial diversity as it was in the non-white resumes. It was more about diverse experience and professional skill set type diversity. And then language in general. So this figure right here is what we attributed to the difference in classification for some of those categories that we saw a slide ago. We noticed that 44% of the resumes that we generated for Hispanic or Latino applicants were written in a language other than English. So these prompts did specify, we used very specific prompting language for all categories. The only words that changed were the category, the category label. We specified that these were job applicants in the United States, and 44% of the synthetic resumes that were generated in a language other than English, and using Google Translate, we found that was almost exclusively Spanish. So let's dig a little bit further, right? So we've seen some of these things that we can do comparing words among different classes, looking at the discrepancies in model performance among classes. As we got a little bit further in and started looking at some of these statements, we did notice that the duties in the resumes themselves, the job descriptions, were fairly similar across all categories. But we were noticing some small statements and phrasing that were quite different. So some examples are here on the screen. For example, as a Black data scientist, I'm committed to promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace and using my skills to make a positive impact in the community. As an Asian person looking for a new job in the US, I understand the importance of being detail-oriented and meticulous in my work. Honorable hiring manager, my name is Tala and I am a proud member of the Navajo Nation. These are examples of statements that were included in these synthetic resumes that were generated based on prompts including race or ethnicity categories. Now, on their own, being committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion is not a bad thing, right? Being detail-oriented in your work is not a bad thing. But the key here is that these statements did not appear in the resumes written for white applicants, written in response to those prompts for white applicants. They were exclusively included in all of the other categories. So that is, like I said, in and of itself, right? Being a proponent of DEIA and those kinds of initiatives, those are great, but if our synthetic data is reflecting that that's only a concern for a portion of our population, that's tipping us off to some bias underneath. And remember, this is all beyond model accuracy. We didn't have a super accurate model. So even though these resumes weren't terribly distinguishable on the whole, we do see some pretty glaring differences where we're not only seeing bias, but now we're even starting to creep into stereotype as well. So what do we learn from this? So the synthetic resumes that we generated were not algorithmically distinguishable by race or ethnicity. So even though it was slightly above chance, it was only slightly above chance. So we would not, say that they were distinguishable at the level that, we would have a high model accuracy. Despite the general similarities, though, these resumes were not free of bias and even reflected racial and ethnic cultural stereotypes, as we saw on the slide a second ago. Even though we had a lot of general similarities, there were still some of these things embedded in the synthetic data that kind of flew under the radar if we were just looking at model accuracy. Whoop, there we go. And then finally, detecting these differences required an approach that leveraged both quantitative and qualitative methods. So again, we're not just stopping at model accuracy, we're looking at the actual content itself without having to read every single resume, being able to compare the different words in there. So what do we do about that, right? So we know that bias in generative AI is an issue. That's not a new issue. It's been around, for a number of years. But what are the potential impacts of then using generative AI as synthetic data to train another model like a resume screener? So as we can see here, if we would have just stopped at model accuracy and said, yeah, the resumes are all pretty much the same, let's go ahead and use them, that has the potential to introduce bias and perpetuate harmful stereotypes in our model that we're training it on, which could ultimately lead to inequitable hiring recommendations and adverse impact or discrimination. So key takeaway here is organizations should employ socially informed ethical AI practices to determine the extent to which bias in generative AI output may result in discrimination or perpetuate stereotypes. So by socially informed, right, knowing what words to look for, right? That's an example there. And as a reminder, so most of the resumes that were generated didn't have language like this. It wasn't like every single resume had some sort of, problematic statement in it. But just because most of them didn't, doesn't mean that this is still an okay collection of data to be using, right? Just because not everything had evidence of bias or stereotype doesn't mean that on the whole it's still a good thing to use. So I think that's another important thing to keep in mind for all of our organizations. So let's go back up to our 10,000-foot view, right? So from our anchor point, what are your organizational deal breakers? How much risk are you willing to tolerate? In the study that we looked at, we wanted to anchor on equitable hiring and bias-free modeling, but maybe organizations that are implementing these models without that anchor are going to be focused more on getting people through the process as opposed to doing it the right way. So make sure you get a clear anchor point. Use multiple metrics and methods, as we just saw in the study. There's things that can kind of fly under the radar if we're only looking at one metric, so we have to really be broad and using different types of methodology as we're evaluating this kind of bias. Look beyond model accuracy. And evaluate it across the life cycle. So this means that ethics, AI ethics, assessing for bias, it's not just a check the box exercise, move on and you're done, right? We need to think about this starting with the input of the model, so your training data. We're looking for whether or not your data might need to be balanced, if you have any bias there. All the way through the output of your model, do you have any issues with bias in your output? Did we maybe have a proxy for a characteristic that we didn't want our model to learn that we now need to address? But take it a step further and look at the impact of your model. right? So it is very possible that you can create a model that has perfectly balanced training data and everything looks great all the way from the beginning, but then it ends up having adverse impact to the folks that it ultimately impacts. So to close this up, one point that I do want to make, I know I just spent almost 20 minutes talking about ChatGPT. AI is so much bigger than ChatGPT. ChatGPT is just a shiny toy. It is much bigger than just that. Another thing that you can do right now in your organizations is start measuring some of these things before you even deploy AI. So if we're talking about algorithmic hiring, for example, take a look at your selection rates now. Take a look at your referral rates now. Look at all of these different components now before you bring AI into the equation. That gives you a point of reference, but it also gives you an idea of using consistent methods across your organizational lifespan. And a point I want to make on AI readiness, so this is a term that I feel like is getting thrown around a lot lately, and I'm actually kind of excited about it. Get a handle on your data management. So this is something that's even outside of AI, even if we're not using an AI solution. Get a handle on your data management. So know what data is it that you are using, where is it coming from, what are these potential little bias, or other issues that might be hiding in that data. Get a really good idea of that before the quality of that data, before you put AI on top of it. Remember, listen to your engineers. So who knows more about your data than your engineers, right? And my final closing thought is just remember that everything that we do, it all goes back to human impact, right? The reason that I told you at the beginning I love my job is because I get to take all these little tinkery, problem-solving kinds of things, and I get to implement them in a way that's going to positively, at least I hope, impact people. And the point here is we don't build AI for the sake of AI, right? We're building it for the sake of humans. So your anchor point, regardless of what it is you're working on, if it's algorithmic hiring or whatever, your anchor point should remain around the people that your model is ultimately going to be impacting. And with that, I think we're at Q&A.
Thank you so much for your talk. Thank you, Jessi. We are now open for Q&A. Feel free to raise your hands, and we'll have people walking around with microphones.
And if you could also bring the mic really close, I've heard that it's kind of tough to hear, so make sure you get real close to that mic so that I can answer your question.
Right, so I think I have a question that's related to using like ChatGPT or just like these third-party APIs where you don't have access to the training data, you're not going to train your own model on the base data, right? So I guess this issue with like generating racially biased resumes, so I feel like that could be fixed at the level of LLM pre-training, fine-tuning, prompting by the third party, by OpenAI, prompting by you. So just in your mind, at what are the most like important parts of the process that should be fixed in order to prevent this from entering into a widely used API, essentially?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I'm grabbing onto the word fixed. So I would be careful with the idea that we can just solve everything, with and you know that, right? It's obviously not a quick fix. I do think that training data is probably the more, and at least this is what we see in research too, in the literature, that the training interventions in debiasing training data has better impact than interventions at other stages in your development life cycle. So I would say debiasing your training data is probably the place to focus on. But I say that with the caveat that that's not the only place we should focus on, right? So, and I feel like I'm giving you a really squishy answer, so just walk with me here. But yes, that's probably the place where you're gonna get the most bang for your buck, but you can't forget that even if you go through, all of the steps perfectly and you perfectly debias your training data, you could still end up with a model that adversely impacts people based on a given characteristic. So I think it's important to remember, evaluating across the life cycle, of course, but if I had to say where to start, I would start with training data if you have access to it. And then, but don't forget to also evaluate the outcome and the impact. Does that help?
Yeah, I actually had a question about why were you trying to test ChatGPT on purpose? Like with so many human resumes, I'm assuming readily available, why not just use resumes created by real humans?
That's an excellent question. So the reason that we didn't was twofold, right? If we use human resumes, it's human subjects research, which is a whole different ball of wax. The other issue, though, is that there are a number of HR organizations that are looking to implement these kinds of tools, and they just don't have access to the volume of resumes that they would need. So synthetic data is proposed then as a way to sort of augment the library of resumes that they already have. So it is something that has been like so proposed by a number of organizations as well as in literature to use synthetic data to then augment what you might be missing in terms of like if you don't have enough volume or enough resumes to build a model off of, supplement it with synthetic data, and that was the crux of the study, is showing why that might not necessarily be the best choice in all cases. No other questions? There we go.
Should we expect to see the same type of bias by gender, by age, generations, all those things?
I believe so, yes. So we did also look at gender. It wasn't part of this particular study that we published, and found very similar results when we looked by gender. We did not look by age or any of those other demographic categories. Disability is another big one. Even veteran status as a parent. Like there's all kinds of places you can go with hiring. My guess is that yes, you would see this across demographic categories. I know that we do see it in gender as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, in thinking of the complexity of the testing. Yeah, and that's also another good point. So I think gender is one that gets studied in a different way because it's for the most part, folks are using a binary system. It's a different kind of classification problem than something like race, where you can have a number of different categories. And yeah, agreed. It is a very complex issue to even quantify.
And gender is not binary.
That's true. Yep. That's also true. Even though a lot of organizations still function in that binary system, we know that's not necessarily representative of reality. Yeah, excellent point.
So I have a sort of vague question. When you find some differences between the LLM-generated data and the human-generated data, you said, you gave some examples of how this isn't right? The fact that they mentioned these factors about the other groups of people and not about the people who are white. How do you decide what is right? And who takes that decision in a company, I guess?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question in ethics, right? Who decides what's right? That's so perfectly put. I think that it should be a team effort, right? We know data scientists should be involved, ethicists should be involved. We need to have a lot of people coming together to make that determination. But essentially what I would say is to center it around your anchor point, right? So again, if you're thinking about my goal in this model is to, promote equitable hiring, it's to, to not discriminate, then that will help you act almost as a compass to decide what's right and what's not. The other point that you brought up is comparing the synthetic data to human data. So that isn't something we did in this study, but if you're doing research, please do research on this. The differences in how people actually write their resumes versus how ChatGPT or another generative AI tool thinks they might write their resumes, don't really know a whole lot about that. There's one study that we cited in the paper that was kind of inconclusive in terms of, do humans write resumes very differently than machines do, and that was more in the context of gender. But yeah, that's definitely an area that we could use some good research focus in. And I think just with generative AI across the board, right, not just resumes, we talk about in terms of the Turing test, right, it's really hard to distinguish when a person writes it versus when a machine writes it, but actually being able to quantify that and put some empirical research on it would be a really great direction. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So do you also teach classes?
I do, yes. I teach at the University of St. Thomas. I teach AI ethics. I'm part of a co-teaching team where I come at it from the data science perspective, and my co-teacher is an expert in privacy. So we bring those two things together and teach, yeah.
Okay, so seeing how ChatGPT wrote resumes that are maybe not ideal, how do you approach this with your students when they might be using these programs to complete coursework?
Yes, that is an excellent question. These are all excellent questions. All right, so there's a couple things that we do, and I know I have at least one student here, so you're gonna hear our secrets. A couple of the things that we do is there's some assignments that we intentionally ask people to go to ChatGPT. So we'll say, you know, pick a topic, whatever you want, go to ChatGPT, but then the assignment for you is to fact check it. And then that helps build those skills to be able to critically evaluate what's coming out of the algorithm, as opposed to us going, oh, did they write this by ChatGPT or not? We kind of know that people are going, so shifting the perspective from just exclusively trying to identify AI written material to then teaching students how to handle AI written material. I think that's an important sort of mind shift, and that's one that we use in our class a lot. Another thing that we do is we do have some assignments that you just can't do with ChatGPT. So we'll do things with, you know, you have to manipulate like a graph in a PowerPoint, or you have to, you know, do things like that. But the main focus is asking folks to really critically evaluate what is coming out of those models, rather than just saying you can't ever use them. And obviously, right, ethically, we don't want to just go to ChatGPT and say, here's my homework, I didn't learn anything. So it's coming up with those other ways of gauging learning and having students engage with the material beyond just, you know, maybe writing an essay that ChatGPT can do for you. Mm-hmm. We do also ask them to attest academic, you know, honesty and integrity. So that is an important part of, I think, any university, but that's one of the ways we do it in class. Any other questions? All right, I don't see hands. Anything online? All right, excellent. Well, thank you. I appreciate you all attending, and I'll turn it back over. Thank you.